By the middle years of the Second World War, the fighting across the Pacific had become a slow and brutal crawl over volcanic stone and choking sand. The United States needed isolated islands to serve as airfields and emergency landing strips for bombers returning from long missions. Every captured piece of land pushed American air power closer to the Japanese mainland. Japanese commanders understood this with absolute clarity, and they transformed even the smallest islands into lethal fortresses designed to drain the invading forces at any cost. On these islands, nothing resembled traditional battlefields. Instead of open terrain, the Marines encountered tangled jungle, jagged cliffs, and concrete bunkers carved directly into volcanic rock. On Iwo Jima, entire tunnel networks stretched beneath the surface, allowing Japanese troops to shift positions unseen and emerge where least expected. The ground looked empty from the outside, but beneath the ash lay hidden chambers, firing ports, and labyrinths that turned the island into a three-dimensional battlefield. The surface itself felt alive, capable of erupting with gunfire at any moment. Grenades and rifles could only do so much against defenders buried deep in stone. Naval bombardments thundered for days before the landings, sending columns of ash into the sky, but when the smoke drifted away, many gunports still waited silently for the approaching Marines. The Japanese strategy was not to repel the initial landings with dramatic charges. Instead, they chose to make every meter of ground a trap. Attackers would inch forward under relentless fire, disappearing into bursts of smoke or flame as they tried to root out positions they could barely see. In this harsh environment, flamethrowers grew from specialized tools into essential weapons. The M2 family of flamethrowers was a heavy apparatus worn on a Marine's back. Two metal tanks held thickened gasoline, and a smaller cylinder carried compressed gas. A hose connected the tanks to the weapon in the operator's hands. When triggered, a pressurized stream of fuel surged forward and ignited at the nozzle, forming a roaring arc of fire that could reach dozens of meters. The flame clung to surfaces, rolled into cave mouths, and filled cramped spaces in ways that explosives could not. But carrying the weapon came at a terrible cost. Loaded with fuel, it weighed enough to slow even the strongest Marine. Every step in the deep black sand felt like pushing against water. The fuel burned quickly, so the operator had only a few short bursts to achieve his goal. Once flame erupted from the nozzle, every enemy in sight could trace the blazing stream back to its source. Snipers learned to look for the distinctive tanks on a Marine's back, and many flamethrower operators fell before they ever reached firing range. Their casualty rate became one of the highest of any role in the Pacific. Still, commanders kept calling for more fire. Experience from earlier island campaigns showed how effective flame could be against fortified positions, especially when combined with armored support. Engineers converted Sherman tanks into flame tanks, replacing their cannons with powerful flamethrower systems that could unleash searing jets over great distance. These armored flamethrowers became some of the most valued weapons on the battlefield, clearing paths where shells and small arms had failed. Iwo Jima was destined to test every version of the weapon. The island itself was small, barely a speck on the map, crowned by a volcanic mountain and laced with sulfur vents that hissed underfoot. Beneath the ground waited thousands of Japanese defenders, ordered to inflict maximum casualties and fight to the end. Above them lay the goal, a series of airstrips desperately needed for planes returning from long bombing runs over the Japanese mainland. On the morning of February 1945, the first waves of landing craft approached Iwo Jima's dark beaches. Marines spilled out into thick ash that swallowed their boots and made every breath taste of sulfur. Shells exploded along the slopes. Tanks lumbered forward while bulldozers attempted to carve crude paths through the unstable ground. For a moment, the eerie silence from the defensive positions gave some Marines hope that the bombardment had succeeded. Then the island came alive. Hidden machine guns, mortars, and cannons erupted from pillboxes and cliffs. Bullets skimmed low across the sand. Mortar rounds crashed into shallow foxholes that collapsed as quickly as they were dug. Progress slowed to a crawl as Marines searched for any angle to advance without stepping into a lethal crossfire. Amid the chaos, flamethrower teams began their grim work. Each team consisted of an operator and rifleman whose only purpose was to protect him long enough to reach a target. They moved from crater to crater, checking valves and counting the few precious bursts of flame they carried. When a bunker pinned down a company or halted the movement of tanks, these teams were called forward, knowing that their survival depended on seconds and timing. Among the Japanese defenders, the fear of flame was deeply rooted. Those who had faced it on earlier islands knew the horrors it brought. Fire did not simply burn. It consumed the air, filled chambers with suffocating smoke, and left no safe corner in a bunker. Sometimes the mere sight of a flamethrower advancing caused defenders to abandon positions that had resisted grenades, rockets, and artillery. The battle for Iwo Jima would rage for 36 days. By its end, American casualties would number in the tens of thousands, and nearly the entire Japanese garrison would be destroyed. Flamethrowers and flame tanks became critical in dismantling the vast underground network beneath the island. In the midst of this hellish landscape was a quiet Marine corporal from West Virginia named Herschel Woodrow Williams. He had trained with the flamethrower before, but on this island his name would become forever linked with the weapon he carried and with a single day that would test every ounce of strength he possessed. For now, he was just one figure among thousands moving forward through ash and smoke, unaware that the moment that would define his legacy was approaching. In the days after the landings, the Marines pushed inland at a pace measured not in meters but in bodies. Every advance demanded hours of crawling, digging, and waiting under the watchful eyes of defenders hidden in rock. The island's black sand absorbed footprints and blast craters alike, turning the surface into an uneven sea of ash that shifted under every bootstep. For flamethrower operators like Herschel Woodrow Williams, the terrain felt like an enemy of its own, resisting each movement with soft ground that swallowed strength with every stride. Williams had carried the flamethrower before, but Iwo Jima made the burden heavier. The twin fuel tanks pressed against his spine, swaying slightly with each step, and the hose along his arm felt stiffer in the cold morning air. The weapon was lifeline and curse wrapped together. Without it, the infantry around him had little chance of prying the Japanese from their tunnels. With it, he became a glowing target the moment flame touched the air. He knew this well, and yet he moved forward each morning when his squad received its assignments, checking his valves and ignition system with quiet focus. By now, the battle had settled into a grim routine. The Marines advanced from one shattered ridge to another, only to discover new tunnel networks feeding fresh lines of fire. Tanks rumbled forward where the ground allowed, using their thick armor to shield advancing troops, but the volcanic terrain often trapped them in pits of ash or exposed them to hidden anti-tank guns. When a tank was knocked out, its smoking hull became another piece of cover on a battlefield filled with twisted metal and rising steam. Flamethrower teams were constantly being called to the front. Sometimes they were summoned to silence a stubborn bunker that had held up entire platoons for hours. Sometimes they were needed to clear cave mouths that looked empty but suddenly erupted with fire from deep within. Williams learned to read the ground, spotting the faint lines of disturbed ash that hinted at concealed firing slits. The Japanese had crafted their defenses with incredible precision, angling their openings so they could sweep long stretches of terrain while remaining nearly invisible from the front. Every approach became a puzzle of shadows, craters, and timing. Williams and the Marines assigned to protect him often crawled for long minutes at a time, their faces inches from the ash, listening for machine gun bursts that marked a defender's position. When the moment came, Williams would rise just high enough to aim the nozzle, counting in his mind the seconds of fuel he could afford to use. A burst too early meant wasted flame. A burst too late meant death for someone already exposed. The Japanese defenders had their own rhythm. They often held fire until Marines were close, then opened with sudden, violent precision. In some tunnels, the defenders waited silently until a flamethrower operator approached. They knew that killing the man with the tanks would buy more time, even if it cost them the position later. This knowledge weighed on every step Williams took. He moved with caution not out of fear but out of understanding. He had only so many chances before the island's defenders found him. But the fear worked both ways. Many Japanese soldiers had already witnessed what flame could do inside the tight confines of their underground world. When fire entered a bunker, it did not simply burn, it cascaded through small openings, pulled oxygen from the air, and left suffocating smoke that filled lungs with scorching fumes. Some defenders abandoned their posts the moment they recognized the wobbling silhouette of fuel tanks in the distance. On Iwo Jima, flame carried a psychological force greater than any other weapon, a force Williams learned to rely on even more than the flame itself. The Marines around him came to respect the quiet corporal. He did not speak much about the danger he carried, nor did he dwell on the losses mounting around them. Instead, he focused on simple routines. He checked the pressure in his cylinders. He wiped ash off the nozzle after every crawl through the sand. He practiced lifting the heavy hose quickly, knowing that the brief seconds before firing could mean survival. These actions became his anchor in a world that felt constantly on the edge of collapse. Each night, Williams fell asleep with the distant sound of explosions echoing across the island. The horizon glowed faintly where battles continued into the darkness. Sometimes the ash trembled from detonations deep underground, as engineers tried to collapse tunnels with explosives. The air was thick with sulfur and smoke. Even in rest, the island reminded him that it was alive with unseen enemies. As the days stretched on, Williams began to hear more frequent reports of tanks being halted by a cluster of pillboxes tied together through the tunnel system. These positions had stalled multiple advances and inflicted heavy casualties. The narrow terrain around them made it difficult for armor to maneuver, and infantry alone could not reach the firing ports without being cut down. Commanders discussed the problem daily, searching for a way to break the deadlock. Whispers began to circulate among the flamethrower teams that a major push was coming. The positions ahead were too strong to leave untouched, and the battle would not move forward until those pillboxes were destroyed. Williams sensed that the island was funneling him toward a moment he could not avoid. The Marines needed fire, and he was one of the few left who could bring it forward. He woke one morning feeling the familiar weight of the tanks settle against his back as he stood. The air was colder than usual, carrying a thin mist that clung to the ground. In the distance, the crack of gunfire rose and fell like a heartbeat. The day felt no different from the others, yet something in the way officers moved from position to position hinted at urgency. Somewhere ahead, hidden under layers of ash and stone, a line of reinforced pillboxes waited. They had already bled the Marines for days. And soon, Williams would be asked to walk toward them with fire on his back. As the fighting dragged on, the front lines near the airfields settled into an uneasy pattern of movement and sudden violence. The Marines could see the runways in the distance, strips of broken pavement and ash that represented the reason they were on the island at all. Between them and those airstrips stood a knot of pillboxes and buried positions that seemed to absorb every attack and answer with a storm of bullets. The Japanese defenders had chosen their ground carefully. Their pillboxes were low and squat, built of reinforced concrete and volcanic rock, with firing slits that faced across open approaches. Some were linked by tunnels so that when one position came under heavy fire, machine gunners could shift to another unseen route and reappear from a different angle. From the Marines' perspective, it felt as if they were fighting a single, multi-headed fortress rather than separate strongpoints. Tanks had tried to break the deadlock. Sherman tanks rolled forward with infantry sheltering behind their hulls, their tracks grinding the black sand into deep ruts. Every time they approached this cluster of pillboxes, hidden guns and well-placed explosives answered. Anti-tank fire struck from narrow openings in the rocks. Mines buried in the ash detonated under treads. One by one, tanks were disabled, their crews scrambling out under fire or disappearing within smoke and flame. Soon, the ground in front of the pillboxes was littered with stopped machines, forming a rough graveyard of steel. The result was a deadly funnel. The Marines needed to pass through that area to keep the advance moving, but any attempt to cross left them exposed to overlapping fields of fire. Units tried to flank the positions only to realize that more bunkers waited on the ridges to either side, connected to the same underground system. The enemy did not need to charge or maneuver in the open. They only had to stay hidden, wait, and fire whenever a helmet or boot appeared where they expected it. For flamethrower operators, this section of the battlefield quickly gained a dark reputation. Reaching those pillboxes meant crossing ground that had already claimed tanks. The ash was churned into deep, uneven waves by blast after blast. There was little natural cover, only shallow craters and the hulks of wrecked vehicles. To reach firing range, a man carrying fuel on his back would have to move through all of it while remaining under constant observation. Herschel Williams heard the stories as they filtered back through the lines. He heard about squads pinned down for hours behind the burned-out shell of a tank, about stretcher teams crawling through smoke just to retrieve the wounded. Some Marines came back with 1,000-yard stares after spending a day within sight of those pillboxes, describing the feeling of being watched by guns they could not quite locate. Others did not come back at all, their paths ending somewhere along that narrow stretch of ash between the Marines and the airfields. Williams did not treat these stories as rumors. He treated them as a map. Each account added to his understanding of where the pillboxes sat, how they were likely angled, and where someone with a flamethrower might find a shallow approach. He listened closely when men described the direction of machine gun fire, the way bullets stitched the ground, or the places where mortar rounds tended to fall. In his mind, he drew a picture of the obstacle he had not yet seen clearly with his own eyes. Around him, his small circle of comrades formed a kind of moving crew. Among them were riflemen whose names would soon be forever linked to his. Corporal Warren Bornholz and Private First Class Charles Fisher were two of the Marines tasked with protecting flamethrower operators like Williams. Their role was deceptively simple. They had to stay near him, watch the angles he could not, and use their rifles to suppress any enemy who tried to cut him down before he reached his target. Their job demanded a different kind of courage. They did not carry the heavy tanks, but they walked in the shadow of them, knowing that every enemy sniper and machine gunner would be searching for that silhouette. A flamethrower crew on the move was like a flare on the battlefield. The moment the fuel ignited, attention would lock onto them. Bornholz and Fisher understood that, yet each day they checked their weapons, adjusted their gear, and moved out alongside the man with the tanks. The days leading up to Williams's defining mission were filled with constant adjustments at the command level. Officers studied aerial photographs, field sketches, and first-hand reports. They knew that the pillboxes ahead had already stopped or slowed more than one attempt to push through. Casualties were mounting. Units that had expected to advance a certain distance each day found themselves stalled within a few hundred meters of where they had started. The airfields remained tantalizingly close and painfully unreachable. As pressure built, the demand for a decisive action grew louder. The Marines could not remain pinned in place forever. The longer they stayed in front of those pillboxes, the more bodies the ash would claim. Engineers could try more explosives. Artillery could pound the area again. But as the Marines had already learned on other islands, there were times when only fire directed straight into bunker openings could truly break a position. On the morning of 23 February 1945, the atmosphere around the front near the airfields felt different. The usual noise of battle was still there, the constant rumble of distant guns and the sharp rattle of small arms, but there was a tighter focus to the movement of officers and runners. Orders moved along the lines like a current. Men were told to prepare for another push toward the same stubborn knot of defenses that had haunted the previous days. Williams checked his gear with deliberate care. The tanks were filled. The compressed gas cylinder was secured in place. The hose showed no cracks. The ignition unit at the nozzle was clean, ready to throw sparks into the stream of fuel. He had performed this ritual many times, but this time the space around him buzzed with a different kind of energy. Bornholz and Fisher readied their rifles, adjusted their helmets, and watched the direction from which the final word would come. When the order finally arrived, it was clear and specific. Tanks were again being halted by the same line of pillboxes. The Marines needed someone to go forward and deal with the bunkers that were tearing up the armor and infantry alike. The path would not be easy. It would mean moving out across that ground of churned ash and wrecked steel, into an area already proven deadly. Williams stepped forward to take on the task, the weight of the flamethrower settling more heavily than ever across his shoulders. Around him, the sounds of the battlefield narrowed into something distant and muted. Ahead lay the pillboxes that had resisted everything thrown at them so far, each one a block of fire and concrete that stood between the Marines and their goal. He began to move toward them, one careful step at a time, with Bornholz and Fisher at his side and a line of stalled tanks behind him that needed the way cleared. The 4 hours that would shape his name and legacy had not yet unfolded, but with each stride over the black sand, he closed the distance to the moment when flamethrower fuel and fortified stone would finally meet. The ground in front of the stalled tanks looked like something scraped from the bottom of a furnace. Black ash had been churned into ridges and furrows by explosions and treads, leaving an uneven path filled with smoking holes and twisted metal. The wrecks of earlier attempts lay scattered across the slope. Some tanks rested at odd angles, their tracks broken, their hulls scarred by hits. Others were burned out, their interiors emptied by fire. Every one of them marked a place where someone had already tried to break the line and failed. Herschel Williams moved out with the weight of his flamethrower steady against his spine. The straps dug into his shoulders as he advanced past the last bit of relative cover. Behind him, Marines pressed low to the ground, weapons ready, watching to see if he could open a path where shell and steel had not. On either side of him, Warren Bornholz and Charles Fisher shifted forward in short bursts, using every fragment of wreckage they could find as cover, their rifles scanning the slopes ahead. The pillboxes they faced were not dramatic from a distance. To an untrained eye they might have looked like low lumps of stone. But the Marines had already learned how deadly those shapes could be. Each one was a block of reinforced concrete and rock with a narrow firing slit, angled to command long stretches of ground. Behind the slit, machine guns waited in dark chambers, and behind those chambers, tunnels led away into the depths of the island. Williams studied the terrain as he advanced. He knew from earlier reports that the main pillbox commanding this section of the line sat slightly offset from the others, giving it a clear view of the ground where the tanks were struggling. He also knew that if he exposed himself directly in front of the firing slit, the defenders would cut him down before he could raise the nozzle. The only hope lay in finding a path that brought him close at an angle the defenders were not watching as closely. He dropped into a shallow crater formed by an earlier explosion and felt the ash rise around his boots. Loose grit crept into his gear with every movement. Bornholz slid in beside him, scanning the ridgeline. Fisher took up a spot slightly lower, watching a different angle. For a moment they paused, catching their breath while mortar fragments and bullets tore the air above the rim of their shelter. The front lines around them were alive with movement. Farther back, Marines were using the halted tanks as shields, firing from behind their hulls toward any muzzle flash they could spot. Artillery detonations rolled across the island, sending shockwaves through the ground. The sky over the battlefield was hazy with smoke and dust, turning the sun into a dull disk that cast a flat light across everything. Williams rose just enough to look toward the nearest pillbox. From this closer viewpoint he could see more detail. The firing slit was a thin horizontal line in the concrete, recessed back to make it harder for incoming rounds to hit. The surface around it was pitted where previous attacks had struck, but the structures still held. Somewhere in that shadowed line, machine gunners were waiting. The plan was simple, though nothing about it felt easy. Williams would work his way up using the scattered wrecks as cover, keeping low until he was within effective range. When the moment came, he would aim the nozzle into the slit or vent openings and send flame inside, forcing the defenders out or silencing them where they stood. Bornholz and Fisher would stay close enough to protect him, firing at any movement from neighboring positions. He checked the hose one more time, feeling the stiffness of the fuel line under his gloved hand. The tanks on his back were heavy with gasoline thickened to make it cling. The compressed gas cylinder was charged, ready to drive the fuel out in a pressurized stream. He had only seconds of fire in those tanks, and he needed every one of them to count. When the next burst of machine gun fire shifted slightly away, Williams moved. He climbed out of the crater and sprinted in a low crouch toward the nearest burned-out tank. Ash sprayed under his boots. Bullets snapped past, some close enough that he could feel the air they displaced. He reached the tank's side and pressed in against the metal, the heat from earlier flames still faintly trapped in the steel. Bornholz and Fisher joined him in quick succession, their chests rising and falling as they sucked in the sulfur-touched air. From this new point, the pillbox seemed closer, but still not quite within the distance he needed. Another few meters, another piece of cover. That was how every flamethrower approach worked. The journey came in segments, each one a risk taken in exchange for a slightly better angle. They waited until a nearby Marine squad opened up with concentrated fire on the pillbox. Tracer rounds sparked against the concrete face, drawing some of the defenders' attention. In that brief window, Williams moved again, racing toward a low fold of ash that offered the promise of protection. He dropped behind it as bullets chewed into the sand where he had been a heartbeat earlier. Now he could see the pillbox clearly, close enough that details stood out. The surface around the slit was darkened, possibly from earlier attempts at using flamethrowers or explosives. Small vents dotted the sides, needed to let out smoke and allow air exchange for the men inside. Those vents were also potential entry points for flame. Williams studied them quickly, committing their positions to memory. He knew from training and earlier battles that he would get only a short burst before the defenders reacted. The first stream of fire would shock them, but if he failed to incapacitate them, they could return fire or retreat deeper into the tunnel system, only to emerge later at another opening. The goal was not only to frighten them. It was to destroy their ability to keep that machine gun operating. A signal came from further back. It was time. Williams rose into a half-crouch, feeling the tanks shift with the movement. He braced his feet in the ash, aimed the nozzle toward the firing slit, and pressed the trigger. The ignition system spat sparks into the stream of fuel, and a jet of fire erupted from the tip, stretching across the gap in a bright, rolling torrent. For a brief instant the battlefield noise seemed to dim beneath the roar of escaping gas and burning fuel. The flames struck the front of the pillbox and poured into the slit, washing along the opening and forcing its way inside. It rolled upward and outward at the same time, clinging to the rough concrete and reaching for the vents. Smoke billowed out almost immediately, dark and thick, mixing with the ever-present ash. Williams released the trigger after a short burst, conserving what little fuel he had. He dropped back down behind the fold of ground as return fire lanced through the space he had just occupied. Some rounds cracked overhead, others kicked up ash near his boots. Bornholz and Fisher answered with their rifles, sending controlled bursts toward the pillbox and any neighboring position that showed a hint of movement. For a few seconds there was a change in the rhythm of enemy fire. The machine gun that had been dominating this stretch of the field fell silent. Other positions still spoke, but the one that had pinned down the tanks paused, its crew either stunned, dead, or scrambling in the smoke-filled interior. It was a start, not a victory. Williams knew that one burst would not end the threat from this complex of defenses. The pillbox might revive once the smoke cleared. Nearby bunkers might still be fully manned and ready. His tanks were already lighter on his back, a reminder that fuel was limited. To continue the attack, he would have to pull back, refill, and then return to the same killing ground. The path he had just taken would not become safer the second time. Every defender still alive now knew the route a flamethrower could use to approach. Every sniper had seen where he had paused, where he had stood to fire. Yet the stalled tanks behind him still needed a way through, and the pillboxes still blocked that way. Williams began to withdraw toward friendly lines, step by step, his shoulders already anticipating the weight of freshly filled tanks and the knowledge that this had been only the first run into the fire. When Williams reached friendly lines after that first run, the world behind the tanks felt strangely small. Men were pressed into shallow depressions, faces streaked with ash, gear coated in the same gray dust that covered everything on the island. The air buzzed with the overlapping sounds of machine guns, shouted orders, and the distant thud of artillery. Somewhere behind all of that, medics moved between the wounded and the dead, doing what they could to keep one group from joining the other. The tanks on Williams's back felt lighter now, not because the burden of the day had eased, but because he had already burned part of his fuel into the concrete face of the pillbox. That lightness carried its own meaning. It said the mission was only partly complete, that the weapon had done something but not enough. He knew the machine gun in that bunker had fallen silent for a moment. He also knew that silence could be temporary. He dropped to his knees while the flamethrower crew around him went to work. Marine support personnel had learned to treat every second between runs as precious. One man checked the lines and valves, making sure no hit had damaged the gear on the way in or out. Another helped remove the empty tanks, muscles straining as they eased the metal frame off Williams's shoulders. Fresh tanks were swung into place, heavy and full, The straps tightened down until they bit into his uniform. Ash stuck to his sweat, forming a thin paste along his neck and arms. His hands smelled of fuel and burnt powder. He could taste sulfur on the back of his tongue. None of that surprised him. Iwo Jima had a way of pressing itself into every sense, as if the island wanted to make sure no one forgot where they were. While the crew secured the new fuel, reports filtered in from the forward line. Marines near the stalled tanks sent word that the pillbox Williams had hit was damaged but not necessarily finished. Some fire had resumed from the area, though it was less steady than before. Other nearby bunkers were still fully active, pouring bullets into any attempt to move up. The enemy had been shaken, but the knot of defenses remained. There was no long discussion about what needed to happen next. The problem had not changed. The tanks were still trapped. The pillboxes still blocked the way. The airfield still lay ahead, out of reach. If the Marines were to move forward, someone had to go back across that same field of churned ash and wreckage, again and again if needed. Williams stood and rolled his shoulders, feeling the full weight of the new tanks settle into place like a familiar burden. Bornholz and Fisher checked their rifles, wiped ash from their sights, and took positions near him. Neither spoke about what had just happened, nor about the risk of doing it again. They did what Marines on that island did every day. They prepared to move forward the moment the order came. When word reached them, it was simple. Williams was to make another attempt on the same complex of pillboxes, pushing deeper if possible. The machine gun that had briefly fallen silent was still a threat. Other firing points in the cluster needed to be dealt with as well. It would not be one burst this time. It would be several, directed at any opening he could reach. He stepped out onto the ash once more, following almost the same path he had taken earlier. The battlefield had not grown any kinder in the short time since his first run. The hulks of disabled tanks still loomed over the ground, their outlines blurred by drifting smoke. Shell bursts continued to carve new craters into the landscape. The angles of fire from the pillboxes were the same, but now the defenders knew that a flamethrower operator had survived a pass and was likely to return. Every meter forward felt sharper than before. Williams knew where the cover points were now. He also knew they were marked in the minds of the men inside the pillboxes. He crossed the open ground in a low, steady crouch, using the same burned-out tank as a shield, the same folds of ash for brief shelter. Bornholz and Fisher stayed close, eyes flicking from one dark opening to another, ready to fire at any hint of movement. As he reached the familiar fold of ground near the primary pillbox, the air around him erupted in a sudden burst of fire. The defenders had anticipated his route. Bullets cut into the ash, some striking the wreckage behind him. Fragments of rock and metal pattered across his gear. Williams dropped low, pressing himself into the island's surface as Bornholz and Fisher opened up, laying down a sheet of covering fire toward the bunkers. The exchange lasted only seconds, but in a place where everything could change in less than a heartbeat, those seconds mattered. When there was the slightest dip in the enemy's rate of fire, Williams rose just enough to bring the nozzle to bear. He aimed not only at the main firing slit this time, but also at the vents and secondary openings he had memorized. He squeezed the trigger and sent another jet of burning fuel roaring across the gap. Flame washed over the pillbox again, licking at the edges of the slit and pouring into the vents along the side. Smoke boiled out with even greater force than before, darker and denser. For a moment the bunker vanished behind a swirling cloud. The heat rolled back across the ground in a wave Williams could feel even through his gear. He cut the stream after another controlled burst, dropping back into what little cover he had. The machine gun fell silent again, this time for longer. Nearby bunkers, however, continued to fire, and not just at the Marines around the tanks. Some of that fire shifted toward the small patch of ground where Williams, Bornholz, and Fisher lay. The defenders had learned that as long as the man with the tanks kept moving, their positions would remain in danger. Williams used the brief disruption to crawl sideways, adjusting his angle. He wanted a different line on the cluster, a better view of another pillbox feeding into the same interlocked defenses. Moving even a few meters under such concentrated fire carried its own risk, but staying in one place too long carried another. A flamethrower team that lingered became an easy target for mortars or grenades. From this new position, he could see the outline of a second pillbox more clearly. It was set back slightly, positioned to catch Marines who tried to flank the first one. Its firing port had been active moments before, sending bursts toward anyone who dared move beyond the halted tanks. Williams adjusted his stance, braced his feet, and released another blast of flame, this time angling the jet toward the secondary position. The fire struck in a long, arcing line, bridging the distance and detonating in a bright splash against the concrete. Once more, smoke and flames spilled into the opening, rolling along the structure's face and searching for any crack or vent. The roar of burning fuel echoed off the nearby wreckage, mixing with the more distant sounds of ongoing combat across the island. By now, his fuel supply was running low. He could feel it in the way the tanks pulled less heavily at his shoulders and in the slightly different rhythm of the weapon's discharge. A flamethrower operator did not need a gauge to know when the end of a tank was approaching. He could sense it in the behavior of the weapon itself. He gave one final short burst, directed at a vent he had not yet fully saturated, then released the trigger completely. The stream of flame cut off, leaving behind smoke, heat, and the uneasy quiet that often followed such attacks. Any defender still alive inside those bunkers would now be dealing with suffocating fumes, searing temperatures, and an environment in which even breathing had become a struggle. Williams began his withdrawal once again, inching backward at first, then moving in short dashes between what little cover the ground offered. Bornholes and Fisher stayed with him every step of the way, their rifles never still for long, their eyes fixed on the openings that might still conceal a last desperate shot. When the three of them finally slipped back behind the lines, Marines near the stalled tanks reported that more pillbox fire had gone quiet. Some guns remained, but the intensity of the barrage had clearly lessened. The path ahead was not safe, but it was less dominated than before. This pattern would repeat itself through the long stretch of hours that followed. Williams would return to the rear, exchange empty tanks for full ones, and then move out again with the same grim determination, crossing and recrossing the same deadly ground. Each run stripped another layer of strength from the pillboxes. Each burst of flame drove the defenders deeper into shock, confusion, or silence. Time on the battlefield rarely felt like clock time, yet observers later would measure these efforts in the same units used in any other part of life. For hours. That was the span during which Williams moved back and forth under constant fire, attacking one fortified position after another with the only weapon that could reach into their depths. The ash recorded all of it in its own way, marked by new footprints, new craters, and the charred outlines of openings where flame had done its work. The tanks behind him slowly felt the pressure ease. The men around him saw that someone was willing to stand up in a place everyone else had learned to fear. Long before anyone put those hours into official words, the Marines in that corner of the island understood that something rare was happening in front of those pillboxes. A single man with a flamethrower and the comrades who guarded him were slowly turning a fortress of concrete and stone into something that could finally be crossed.